What if the scariest thing about a supervillain wasn't his power level, but his address? Onslaught never lived in a fortress or a hell dimension. He lived inside Professor X for years, watching the X-Men train and argue and sleep, wearing the face they trusted more than any other. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why Onslaught is the X-Men's most terrifying villain, and why the smartest heroes on Earth couldn't stop him without dying to do it. It begins with a moment of restraint that curdled. Born from a mercy, Onslaught's origin isn't a lab accident or a cosmic bargain. It's a decision made by a good man on the worst day of his life. More than 30 years ago, in the crossover fans still call fatal attractions, Magneto tore the adamantium out of Wolverine's skeleton through his pores. Logan lay dying on the floor. Xavier, who had spent his entire adult life preaching restraint, reached into his oldest friend's mind and switched it off, leaving Magneto catatonic. That's the part everyone remembers. Here's the part that matters. Telepathy on that scale isn't a one-way door. In the instant those two minds touched, Xavier absorbed the full weight of Magneto's rage, his grief, his contempt for a species that had earned every bit of it. And that rage found company, because Xavier had been quietly composting his own darkness for decades. Every human politician who called his students animals, every student he buried, every time he smiled and said, "Be patient," while something underneath him screamed, those two things fused, and something started growing in the basement of the most powerful telepathic mind on the planet. Not a possession, not an invader. A tenant Xavier built himself out of his own restraint, sealed behind the discipline he was so proud of. The Juggernaut warning shot. Roughly 30 years ago, Marvel introduced this thing in the smartest way possible. They didn't show him at all. In an issue published just after the Age of Apocalypse ended, the X-Men respond to a disturbance in Hoboken, New Jersey, and find a crater. In the crater is Cain Marko, the Juggernaut, barely conscious and genuinely frightened. He'd been in Canada. Something hit him hard enough to punt him across an international border and drop him into New Jersey like a meteor, and he was crawling toward Westchester to warn the people he'd spent his career trying to kill. Bishop and Beast have to dump the electrical supply of an entire city into him just to calm him down. Salak asks who did this. Cain gives them one word: Onslaught. Here's the detail most retrospectives skip. Scott Lobdell has admitted he had no idea who Onslaught was when he wrote that issue. There was no plan. He just wanted a name frightening enough to rattle the Juggernaut. The name existed before the character did. Jokes aside, that accident is why the build-up works. Nobody could over-explain him because nobody knew what he was yet. For the better part of a year, Onslaught was a rumor with a body count, a voice in one issue, a face in a splash page, a shadow behind a frightened teenager. Meanwhile, the thing doing all that lurking was sitting at the head of the table in Westchester, pouring the tea. Hiding inside the Mentor. Bishop had been warning them for years. When he first time jumped into the present, he brought a prophecy from a burnt-out future. The X-Men were destroyed from within by one of their own, a traitor. He just couldn't put a name to the face. Everyone assumed the answer would be a mole. Gambit, maybe. Somebody with a shady past and a good reason to sell them out. Nobody entertained the possibility that the traitor didn't know he was the traitor, because the traitor was sleeping in the Founder's skull. For a full year of stories, Onslaught worked entirely through proxies. Psychic pressure, nudges, hired muscle sent after targets nobody could explain. And all the while, Charles Xavier kept running the school. He kept training his students to shield their minds. He kept telling them the mansion was the safest place on Earth for people like them. Then, in the issue where he drops the mask at last, Onslaught reveals himself through Xavier's own body, standing in the middle of the Xavier Institute. Jean Grey runs for the communications chamber to scream for help, and he cuts her off mid-sentence. Not mid-conversation, mid-sentence. Think about the practical horror of that for a second. Every drill the X-Men had ever run against telepathic attack, Xavier designed. Every psychic defense they knew, he taught them. Every safeguard in that building was built by the man now looking at them through borrowed eyes. Sinister lies to them. Apocalypse wants to test them. Onslaught had already read their homework, marked it, and handed it back with notes. There's one more twist in that year worth knowing. Exactly one X-Man willingly signed up with him, and it was Hank McCoy. Except it wasn't. The beast standing in the mansion at that point was the Age of Apocalypse version, a sadistic geneticist who had slipped into this reality, and been quietly wearing the real Hank's life. Onslaught didn't need to corrupt anybody on the team. The rot was already sitting at the breakfast table in a cardigan. 2 children, 1 God. Onslaught's plan required 2 very specific people, and both of them were kids. Franklin Richards is the son of Reed and Sue, a boy whose mutant ability isn't strength or speed, but the casual rewriting of reality itself. Nate Gray is the alternate timeline brother of Cable, a psi so powerful his own body was burning itself out trying to contain him. One child who could remake the world, one child who could see and touch every mind in it. Onslaught went about acquiring them with the calm of a man doing paperwork. He raised a citadel in the middle of Central Park, hung a false sun over Manhattan, seized control of every sentinel he could reach, and abducted scientists to build him more. He recruited where recruiting was easy. The Blob, Holocaust, whoever would take the offer. And he used stolen dimensional technology to move his forces around the board. The Juggernaut, who had already been on the receiving end of him, took one look and refused. On the other side, the response was everything Marvel had. The Fantastic Four and Bishop tried to keep Franklin out of reach. X-Force was handed the job of protecting Nate Gray. It didn't matter. He got both boys. And then the story does something I've never quite forgiven it for being so good at. Onslaught started out with Magneto's ambition wearing Xavier's face, a world run by mutants, an end to the pogroms, the camps, the sentinels, everything Eric ever wanted, taken by force. But holding Nate Gray gave him a window into Nate's home reality, the age of apocalypse, where mutants had won, where a mutant sat on the throne of the world, and it was still a slaughterhouse. That's the moment Onslaught stops being a supremacist and becomes something far worse. He looks at the best-case scenario for his own side, sees that it changes nothing, and concludes that the problem isn't which species holds the whip. The problem is that anybody is holding one. So he stops wanting to rule the world and starts wanting to switch it off. The price of victory. Here's where the terror stops being philosophical and starts being a body count. Reed Richards works out the loophole. Onslaught feeds on mutant energy, so mutants attacking him are essentially handing him ammunition. Non-mutants, though, are dead weight in the system. Baseline humans could dilute him from the inside if they were willing to walk into a psionic god and stay there. So they did. The Fantastic Four went in. Most of the Avengers went in. Dr. Doom went in, which tells you everything about how bad it had got. The man will not share a lift with these people, and he walked into a psionic god alongside them without an argument. Bruce Banner, lying half dead in the rubble with the Hulk stripped out of him, dragged himself upright and threw himself in two. The X-Men then hit the weakened energy field with everything they had left, sorrow and fury going out through optic blasts and lightning and claws, and Onslaught came apart in a detonation that lit up Manhattan. Franklin and Nate were pulled free, the boy reaching for his mother's arms as the world went white. The heroes weren't so lucky. Marvel's flagship characters were simply gone. The Avengers, the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Captain America, Thor. Their books ended. What the audience found out later was that Franklin had spun a pocket universe to catch them, which became the Heroes Reborn line. But nobody in the story knew that. To the world, the greatest heroes on Earth had walked into a mutant's mind and never walked out. And the public knew exactly whose mind it had been. Xavier surrendered himself to the authorities, walked into custody, and let the world do what it liked with him. Anti-mutant sentiment went nuclear. That backlash created the political oxygen for Bastion and Operation Zero Tolerance, a government program that spent the following year hunting the X-Men with an efficiency the Sentinels never managed. Sit with that. Onslaught lost. He was destroyed, his hostages were freed, and he still killed Marvel's entire A-list, put Charles Xavier in a cell, and made mutants the most hated minority on the planet. Power without a ceiling. The scale of him is difficult to overstate, and Marvel has never really tried. Start with the baseline. Onslaught had Xavier's telepathy and Magneto's control of magnetism in a single package, which alone breaks most X-Men encounters before they begin. Then add Franklin Richards and Nate Gray, and you're looking at reality manipulation, matter creation, energy projection, and telekinesis operating well past what the Omega classification was ever meant to describe. Every sentinel he touched fell under his command at once, not one at a time, but as a single distributed body. Size and physical strength became adjustable. Matter got reshaped into whatever the moment required. Minds he had never met were read and rewritten, while their owners were still mid-thought. And then he upgraded. Once Xavier was torn out of him on the astral plane, Onslaught didn't weaken. He shed the last human thing about himself. The Magneto costume gave way to something closer to a cybernetic engine with a face, and the power went from terrifying to functionally divine. But the detail that should actually worry you is the helmet. The X-Men's answer to almost everything is a telepath. The entire tactical doctrine of the team assumes somebody can get inside an enemy's head and buy the others 30 seconds. Onslaught wore a helmet specifically designed to lock telepaths out, and he was a telepath. He built the counter to himself and wore it. Ask the Juggernaut how that felt. Cain Marco's own helmet had shrugged off psychic assaults for decades. Onslaught's blasts went through it like it wasn't there, then hit him hard enough to relocate him to another country. He never stays dead. Because Onslaught isn't a body, he's a pattern, and patterns copy. Nearly 20 years ago, he came back, chasing Franklin Richards into the pocket universe the boy had built and taking over Thor and the Hulk along the way. He was stopped only when Ricky Barnes, that reality's Bucky, dragged him into the negative zone with her. Roughly 15 years ago, he surfaced again, and the reveal was nasty. He hadn't simply been trapped with Ricky out there. He had consumed her, then rebuilt her from scratch as an anchor he could use to haul himself back into the world. She spent years being a hero, unaware she was a doorway. Then, just over a decade ago, came the version bordering on farce. A clone of the Red Skull grafted Professor X's brain tissue onto his own to steal the telepathy. Magneto crushed his skull for it. What crawled out was Red Onslaught, and it kicked off a company-wide event. Notice the pattern. Xavier doesn't need to be alive, or willing, or even conscious. All it takes is a fragment of that psyche and enough resentment nearby to feed on. And there has never been a shortage of the second ingredient in an X-Men comic. Hatred is the renewable resource of this franchise. He is the only villain who treats it as fuel rather than an obstacle. That's the difference between a villain who can be beaten and a condition that keeps flaring up whenever the environment allows it. Forgiveness and fresh fear. His most interesting defeat came about 5 years ago during the Krakoan era, and it involved almost no punching at all. Mutants had built a nation where death was temporary and resurrection was routine, and something in that arrangement was rotting. The children whispered about a figure they called the Patchwork Man. Teenagers organized a party called the Cruciball, celebrating how cheap dying had become. Nightcrawler, of all people, was the one who noticed the shadow, and he brought Legion in to help him chase it. What they eventually worked out is the best idea anybody has ever had about this character. Onslaught runs on self-loathing. He is fed by every mutant who quietly believes, somewhere underneath the uniform, that they deserve the hatred aimed at them. So the mutants of Krakoa didn't attack him. They forgave themselves together and starved him out. Even Fabian Cortez, one of the most loathsome men in mutant history, got to matter in that story. Which brings us to now. X-Men 97 has returned for its second season, and the theory crowd is fully mobilized. The show has been laying the ingredients out in plain sight: Magneto's global assault, the psychic collision between Charles and Eric, and a certain enormous red planet glimpsed during a telepathic sequence, sporting a crater shaped suspiciously like the opening in a very familiar helmet. The show has flirted with him before and backed away. This time the pieces are on the board, and the audience can count. If you want a deeper dive on more of your X-Men favorites, make sure you don't miss the 10 X-Men Dr. Doom fears the most. Onslaught works as a villain for one reason. He isn't an invader, he's a receipt. He's the bill that came due for every compassionate lie Charles Xavier told himself, and the X-Men have never fully paid it off. Magneto can be reasoned with, Apocalypse can be outlasted, Sinister can be outsmarted. This one lives in the Founder's head, feeds on his students' shame, and grows back from a fragment. Hope you found this video helpful.